The wind screamed through the towering pines like a living thing, its icy fingers probing every crack in the old log cabin's walls. John Carter exhaled slowly, watching his breath curl in the frigid air, before vanishing into the dim light of the single oil lamp. He rubbed his calloused hands together over the crackling fire, the flames dancing shadows across walls lined with weathered hunting trophies and yellowed maps of the Alaskan wilderness. Outside, the blizzard had been raging for 3 relentless days, transforming the once familiar landscape into an alien world of swirling white. Snowdrifts climbed halfway up the cabin's windows, and the temperature had plunged to 40 below, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. John glanced at the barometer nailed crookedly by the door. The needle hadn't budged from severe storm since morning. He reached for the chipped enamel coffee pot steaming on the cast-iron stove, pouring himself another cup of the thick, bitter brew that had kept him awake through the long Arctic night. The radio on the shelf spat static between emergency weather warnings, something about record snowfall, and residents advised to shelter in place. Not that John needed the warning. After 15 winters in this remote corner of the Brooks Range, he knew better than to challenge nature's wrath. A sudden gust shook the cabin, making the rafters groan. The fire flickered violently as drafts snuck through the old chinking between logs. John was reaching for another log from the dwindling stack when he froze. Beneath the wind's constant howl came another sound, faint but unmistakable. A scraping, scratching, coming from the front door. His hunting knife was in his hand before he'd made the conscious decision to grab it. Bears sometimes emerged during winter storms, desperate and dangerous. Wolves, though rare this close to human habitation, weren't unheard of. But this sound was different, less aggressive, more pleading. The scratching came again, accompanied now by a whimper so soft John wondered if he'd imagined it. He moved silently across the creaking floorboards, the knife held low at his side. The antique thermometer by the door read -42 degrees Fahrenheit. Whatever was outside wouldn't survive much longer. John pressed his eye to the frost-rimmed peephole. At first he saw only the horizontal sheets of snow racing past in the storm's fury. Then movement, a dark shape huddled against the door. His breath caught. Not a bear, not a wolf. A dog? Here? The nearest town was 60 miles south. As he watched, the shape lifted its head, revealing eyes that glowed amber in the cabin's exterior light. Massive paws, nearly the size of his hands, left bloody streaks on the snow-covered porch as the animal tried again to scratch at the door. Then John noticed the other shapes, 3 much smaller ones pressed tightly against the larger animal's belly. The mother dog, for surely that's what she was, turned her head toward the peephole as if she could sense John watching. Her muzzle was crusted with ice, her ribs visible even beneath the thick winter coat. When she whined this time, it carried a note of finality. The sound of a creature who knew death was near but refused to surrender while her babies still breathed. John's hand hovered over the door latch. Every survival instinct screamed at him not to open it. Rabies. Aggression. The very real possibility that letting in this wild creature could end with his throat torn out. But then one of the cubs, barely larger than his boot, lifted its head and made a sound so pitiful it bypassed all logic, and went straight to the primal part of his brain that recognized suffering. The bolt slid back with a metallic clank that seemed absurdly loud. John cracked the door just enough to feel the storm's brutal chill slice through the opening. The mother dog didn't rush forward as he'd feared. She simply lifted her gaze to meet his, her entire body shaking from cold and exhaustion. Up close, John could see the ice matted in her fur, the raw patches on her paws from miles traveled through the snow. Behind her, the cubs were in worse shape. One lay motionless, its breathing shallow. Another tried to stand but collapsed immediately, its tiny limbs too weak from cold and hunger. The third simply stared at John with ancient-seeming eyes that held none of a puppy's usual playfulness. Wind-driven snow swirled into the cabin, melting instantly on the warm floorboards. The mother dog didn't move, as if understanding this was John's decision alone. Her intelligent gaze held his for a long moment before she deliberately lowered her head in what could only be interpreted as submission. A wild creature surrendering its pride for the sake of its young. John's fingers tightened on the door. He thought of the stocked pantry, the extra blankets in the cedar chest, the risks versus the certain death waiting outside. The wind howled its warning as he made his choice. The door swung open wide. "Come on," he said softly, stepping back to make room. "Before we both freeze to death." For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then, with what appeared to be her last reserves of strength, the mother dog nudged her cubs forward with her nose, herding them across the threshold into the warmth and light. Only when all three were inside did she follow, her massive frame barely clearing the doorway. John closed the door against the storm's fury, the latch clicking shut with finality. When he turned, he found the mother dog standing protectively over her cubs in the center of his cabin, water dripping from their melting coats onto the wooden floor. Her golden eyes locked onto his, filled with a mixture of wariness and something else, something that looked suspiciously like gratitude. Outside, the blizzard raged on. But in that moment, within the cabin's walls, an unspoken pact had been made between man and beast. The nature of that pact, and what it would ultimately cost them both, neither could yet imagine. John's fingers hovered over the door handle, his breath coming in shallow puffs that fogged the icy air before his face. Every survival instinct he'd honed over 15 winters in the Alaskan backcountry screamed at him to step away. The wilderness had taught him brutal lessons about mercy, how a moment's compassion could cost a man his life. He remembered old Tom Wilkins' story from 2 winters past, a moose calf abandoned and crying outside Tom's trapping cabin. The fool had taken it in, only to have the enraged mother smash through his window at dawn. They'd found Tom 3 days later, half frozen and bleeding out in the snow. The scratching came again, slower this time, weaker. The rhythm had changed from desperate pounding to something that sounded almost deliberate. 3 slow drags of claws against wood. A pause. Then 2 quick scrapes. Almost like a code. John's pulse hammered in his throat. That wasn't animal behavior. That was number impossible. The wind shrieked around the cabin corners, rattling the storm shutters. Somewhere in the rafters, a loose nail tapped a ghostly rhythm. John realized his palm was sweating despite the cold, his grip on the hunting knife slick. Then came the sound that undid him. Not a growl, not a snarl, but a whine so profoundly human in its desperation that the hairs on John's neck stood erect. It was the sound his own dog had made years ago when caught in that steel trap, a sound that still haunted his nightmares. The oil lamp guttered as another draft found its way through the cabin's bones. Shadows leapt across the rough-hewn walls like living things. John made his decision. He moved silently to the gun rack, trading the knife for his loaded Winchester. The steel was cold against his palm as he worked the lever action just enough to confirm a round was chambered. The click echoed through the cabin. The scratching stopped abruptly. John froze. Whatever was outside had heard, had understood. A new kind of chill worked its way down his spine. He'd hunted every species in these woods, faced charging bears and territorial moose without flinching. But this felt different. The storm outside reached a new crescendo, snow pelting the windows like handfuls of rice. John wiped his free hand on his parka and reached for the heavy-duty flashlight hanging by the door. The aluminum casing was frosted over, so cold it burned his skin through his calluses. He thumbed the switch. The beam cut through the cabin's gloom, illuminating swirling dust motes and the thick frost creeping up the window panes. John approached the door's small, wire-reinforced window, the glass opaque with ice crystals. Using his sleeve, He rubbed away just enough frost to peer outside. The flashlight beam reflected off the storm's whirling snow, creating a disorienting wall of white. Then movement. Dark against dark. John's breath caught. At first his mind refused to process what he was seeing. The shape was all wrong, too large to be a wolf, too lean for a bear. It stood on hind legs, one massive paw braced against the door frame. Not scratching now. Waiting. The beam found eyes first. Gold-flecked and intelligent, reflecting the light back at him with an almost prismatic intensity. They weren't the flat, dull eyes of a starving predator. They held recognition. Purpose. Then the rest came into focus. The creature, because no mere dog had shoulders like that, no wolf carried itself with such deliberate grace, lowered itself to all fours with a quiet groan of exhaustion. The movement revealed three smaller shapes huddled in the snow behind it. Cubs? Puppies? They were so crusted with ice they looked more like snow sculptures than living things. One lifted its head, and John's stomach clenched. The tiny face was all wrong. Muzzle too short, brow too pronounced. It made a sound that wasn't quite a whimper, wasn't quite a cry, but something heartbreakingly in between. The mother, for surely it was a mother, turned her head toward the window. And in that moment John understood two things with absolute certainty. First, this was no ordinary animal seeking shelter. Second, if he didn't let them in, they would die on his porch before midnight. The creature's breath fogged the glass between them as she leaned closer. John could see the ice matting her fur, the raw patches where winter had gnawed through to flesh. But more than that, he saw the calculation in those ancient eyes, the desperate hope. Then she did something that stopped John's heart cold. She lifted her right paw and placed it against the glass. Not a threat, but an unmistakable plea. The pads were cracked and bleeding, the claws broken from what must have been miles of travel through frozen hell. But it was the way she held them that made John's throat tighten. Not splayed like an animal's, but grouped together. Almost like fingers. The flashlight slipped in John's suddenly numb grip. The beam swung wildly, illuminating the cabin's far wall where his grandfather's old shotgun hung above the fireplace. The one loaded with silver slugs for things that go bump in the Alaskan night. When he looked back, the creature hadn't moved. But something in her posture had changed. The proud set of her shoulders had slumped just enough to telegraph exhaustion. The intelligence in her eyes had dimmed to something closer to resignation, as if she'd seen this reaction before, as if she expected to be turned away. One of the cubs let out a shuddering cough that ended in a weak squeal. The sound seemed to decide something deep in John's gut. His hand found the door latch. The creature's ears pricked forward, her whole body tensing. John worked the deadbolt slowly, giving her time to back away if she chose. The metal screeched from disuse. He couldn't remember the last time he'd locked it. Wind screamed through the suddenly open crack, driving snow into John's face like tiny knives. He squinted against the onslaught, the Winchester held ready but not raised. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then the mother creature turned and nosed the smallest cub toward the door. It stumbled, legs stiff with cold, and collapsed against the threshold. The other two followed with equal difficulty, their movements sluggish with hypothermia. John stepped back, making room. "Easy now," he murmured, the words torn away by the wind. The mother watched him for another heartbeat, her golden eyes searching his face for some unspoken promise. Then, with obvious effort, she lowered her massive head and crossed the threshold into the cabin's warmth. The door swung shut behind them with a finality that echoed through John's bones. Outside, the storm raged on. But inside, something new and strange had begun. The storm's breath howled through the cabin's eaves as John stood frozen in the doorway, his fingers turning white around the Winchester's stock. The creature before him wasn't just large, she was monumental. her shoulders nearly level with his waist even in her exhausted crouch. Moonlight filtering through the blizzard caught the ice crystals matting her silver-flecked coat, making her glow like some spectral being from native legends. Her golden eyes held his with an intelligence that prickled the back of John's neck. Not the feral glare of a cornered wolf, but something far more unsettling, a sentient, calculating awareness that watched him watching her. When she blinked, a layer of ice cracked from her eyelashes, revealing raw pink flesh beneath. The cubs at her feet were in worse shape. The smallest, a charcoal gray male with one white-tipped ear, convulsed with shivers so violent John heard its tiny teeth chattering over the wind. Its siblings huddled together, their normally fluffy coats transformed into frozen armor by the storm. The female, he could tell by the slightly more delicate muzzle, had ice clinging to her whiskers in jagged clusters, her breathing coming in shallow, rapid bursts. Then the mother did something that shattered John's last reservations. She lowered her massive head until her muzzle touched the cabin's worn threshold, then deliberately rolled onto her side, exposing her vulnerable belly. The submissive gesture revealed ribs straining against taut skin, and patches where the storm had torn away fur, leaving angry red flesh exposed. A fresh wound along her flank oozed sluggish crimson, the blood freezing before it could drip to the snow. But it was her eyes that held John transfixed. Those impossible golden eyes that seemed to contain lifetimes of sorrow. When she whined again, the sound carried a vibration that resonated in John's sternum, more resonant than any normal animal's vocalization. The cubs immediately stilled, as if awaiting some verdict. John's boot creaked on the floorboards as he shifted his weight. The mother creature's ears twitched at the sound, but she maintained her submissive posture. He noticed then the odd shape of those ears, slightly too pointed at the tips, with extra folds of cartilage that gave them an almost elfin quality. "Jesus wept," John murmured, the old phrase slipping out unbidden. The largest cub, a male with unusual black markings like tribal tattoos across its shoulders, growled weakly when John stepped forward. The mother immediately snapped her jaws in silent reprimand, the click of teeth echoing sharply. The cub ducked its head in immediate obedience. John knelt slowly, keeping the rifle pointed at the ceiling but his finger near the trigger. Up close, the creature's scent hit him. Not the expected musk of wet dog, but something wilder, almost electric, like ozone after a lightning strike mixed with crushed pine needles. It stirred some primal memory in his hindbrain, a warning whisper from humanity's collective unconscious. The mother held perfectly still as John reached out with his free hand. When his fingers neared her injured flank, her lips twitched back slightly, revealing canines longer and more curved than any wolf's he'd seen. But she didn't snap, didn't retreat. Her fur beneath the ice was softer than he expected, with an unusual texture. Not quite hair, not quite fur, but something in between. The wound beneath was worse than he'd thought. Something had taken a chunk of flesh the size of his palm, and infection had begun turning the edges greenish. One of the cubs sneezed violently, spraying pink-tinged snow across John's boots. The mother's head whipped around, her ears flattening in concern. John followed her gaze to the smallest cub, whose breathing had grown alarmingly ragged. Decision crystallized in John's mind. He stood abruptly, making the mother flinch. "Stay," he ordered, as if commanding a normal dog. Her reaction was instantaneous. Those golden eyes widened slightly, her head tilting in a gesture that was disturbingly human. John had the unnerving sense she'd understood the word perfectly. The cabin's medicine cabinet yielded its meager supplies: antibiotic ointment, sterile gauze, a half-empty bottle of veterinary penicillin left over from when he'd kept sled dogs. John hesitated, then grabbed the emergency bottle of moonshine from above the fridge. When he turned back, he froze. The mother creature had risen and was now sniffing cautiously at his bookshelf, her massive body moving with unexpected grace despite her injuries. As he watched, she nudged a framed photo with her nose. John's last hunting trip with his father, 20 years past. Her ears flicked toward him when she sensed his stare, but she didn't startle like a wild animal should. The cubs had spread out, the boldest already investigating the fireplace. John's breath caught when the smallest tried to climb onto his armchair, its tiny claws snagging the quilt his grandmother had made. "Hey, down!" John barked without thinking. All four creatures froze as if struck. The cub on the chair whimpered and scrambled back to its mother, while she fixed John with a look that held neither fear nor aggression, but something far more complex, a silent negotiation of boundaries. John exhaled through his nose. "Right, you're not dogs." The mother's tail gave a single slow wag at that, the motion sending ice crystals tinkling to the floor. Working quickly, John dragged an old dog bed from storage, dust flying as he slapped it against the wall, and arranged it near the fire. The mother watched intently as he spread towels over the stained padding, her nostrils flaring at the scent of long-dead canines. When he gestured toward it, she surprised him by herding the cubs onto the bed with precise nips and nudges, then settling herself around them in a protective circle. Only then did she allow herself to shudder with exhaustion, her breath fogging in the warming air. John approached with the medical supplies, moving slowly. The mother tensed but didn't resist when he dabbed moonshine on her wound. Her muscles jumped under his touch, the heat of her body unnatural even for an animal her size. When he smoothed antibiotic ointment over the injury, he noticed something odd. The edges of the wound seemed to ripple, as if the flesh was actively trying to knit itself back together. A cub's whine distracted him. The smallest was trembling violently despite the fire's warmth. John reached out instinctively, then yanked his hand back when he saw the cub's gums were tinged blue. Shit. Hypothermia. Advanced. John didn't think, just acted. He scooped up the tiny creature, ignoring the mother's warning growl. The cub felt frighteningly light in his hands, its heartbeat fluttering like a trapped bird against his palms. Without hesitation, John unbuttoned his flannel shirt and tucked the cub against his bare chest, rewrapping the fabric around them both. The mother was on her feet in an instant, her massive head level with John's sternum. Hot breath ghosted across his throat as she sniffed her offspring, then locked eyes with John. Something unspoken passed between them in that moment, an understanding, a temporary truce. Gradually, the cub's shivering subsided, its heartbeat steadied. John became aware of the mother's warmth radiating against his side, her body positioned not as a threat, but as a living barrier between him and the other cubs. Protective, yet somehow collaborative. Outside, the storm reached new intensity, snow pelting the windows like gunshot. But in the cabin's glowing heart, an impossible scene unfolded. A grizzled trapper in an armchair, cradling a creature that shouldn't exist, while its mother stood guard like some mythical beast from forgotten lore. And in that fragile moment, John Carter understood with bone-deep certainty that nothing in his life would ever be the same. The door's hinges screamed like a wounded animal as John pulled it open against the storm's resistance. A wall of freezing air slammed into him, carrying stinging snowflakes that melted instantly on his flushed skin. For one suspended heartbeat, nothing moved. The massive creature on his porch simply stared, her golden eyes reflecting the firelight in prismatic shards. Then chaos erupted. The mother lurched forward with a pained whimper, her hindquarters trembling violently as she crossed the threshold. Her oversized paws left bizarre prints, not the symmetrical pad marks of any canine John had ever seen, but asymmetrical impressions with unusual pressure points that made his stomach clench. The claws left deep gouges in the aged pine floorboards, as if they'd been designed for gripping rather than running. The cubs tumbled after her in a tangle of limbs and matted fur. The largest, the male with strange black markings, collided with John's boot before scrambling away, hissing like a feral cat. The female cub made it 3 wobbling steps before her frozen legs gave out, her body slumping against the hearthstones with a dull thud. But it was the smallest cub that stopped John's heart. It lay motionless just inside the doorway, its chest barely rising. Ice had formed delicate crystalline patterns around its nostrils, each labored breath producing a weaker puff of vapor. The mother swung her massive head toward the cub, nostrils flaring as she took in its scent. A sound escaped her, not a growl or whine, but something between a moan and a howl that resonated in John's bones like a struck tuning fork. John moved without thinking. He dropped to his knees beside the cub, his medical training from the war resurfacing through the panic. The tiny body was frighteningly cold, not just winter cold, but death cold. When he peeled back an eyelid, the pupil didn't constrict. The gums, when he pressed them, took 3 full seconds to regain color. Shit! Shit! John ripped off his parka and wrapped the cub in the fleece lining, rubbing vigorously. Come on, little fighter. Not like this. The mother loomed over them, her hot breath steaming John's neck. He braced for attack, but instead felt an impossible weight settle across his shoulders. The creature had draped her massive head over him like a living shawl, her body heat radiating through his flannel shirt. A silent plea, a partnership. John worked faster. He grabbed the moonshine bottle from the shelf, soaking a rag to rub on the cub's paws. The sharp scent made the mother sneeze, but she didn't pull away. The other cubs had crawled close, forming a shivering semicircle around their sibling, their unusual eyes, more green than gold, fixed on John's hands. Gotta get its core temp up, John muttered. He hesitated, then unbuttoned his shirt and pressed the cub directly against his bare chest, rewrapping the parka around them both. The tiny body felt like an ice sculpture leeching the life from him. The mother made that strange vibrating sound again, this time directed at the other cubs. They immediately pressed closer, forming a living blanket around John and their sibling. Heat radiated from their unusual fur, not the normal warmth of animals, but an almost feverish intensity that made sweat break out on John's brow. Minutes crawled by. The storm howled outside. The fire popped and crackled, casting monstrous shadows of their huddled group across the log walls. John lost track of time, focused only on the faint heartbeat beneath his palm. Then, a miracle. The cub twitched, a full-body spasm that made all of them startle. Its muzzle wrinkled in a soundless sneeze, dislodging ice crystals from its nostrils. When John checked the gums again, the capillary refill was quicker. The mother's tongue rasped over the tiny head in rough strokes, her breath coming in ragged gusts that smelled oddly of pine resin and something metallic. John exhaled a laugh that bordered on hysterical. "That's it, tough guy. Fight back." The mother suddenly went rigid, her head snapping toward the door. A low, subsonic growl built in her chest, a sound John felt more than heard. The cubs immediately ducked low, ears flattening. "What? What is it?" John strained to hear over the storm. Then he caught it. A mechanical whine cutting through the wind's howl. Snowmobile engines, getting closer. The mother's reaction was instantaneous. She bodily shoved the cubs toward the darkest corner of the cabin, her movements suddenly frantic. When John didn't move fast enough, she nipped at his sleeve. Not hard enough to break skin, but with unmistakable urgency. The message was clear. Hide them. Now John's mind raced. Whoever was coming couldn't possibly know about these creatures. Unless... The mother's golden eyes locked onto his, pupils dilating until only a thin ring of color remained. In their depths, John saw something that chilled him more than the storm outside. Recognition. Dread. A silent warning that this was no random search party. The engines grew louder, closer. John made his decision. He grabbed the cubs, ignoring their startled yips, and shoved them unceremoniously into the root cellar beneath a pile of empty grain sacks. The mother hesitated, her gaze darting between John and the hiding place. "Go!" John hissed, pointing. With one last searching look, the creature squeezed herself into the impossibly small space, her body contorting in ways that defied anatomy. John barely had time to replace the trapdoor and kick a rug over it before headlights flashed through the windows. A fist pounded on the door. "Carter, open up! Official wildlife business!" John wiped his hands on his pants, took a steadying breath, and reached for the doorknob. The last thing he saw before turning it was a single golden eye watching him through a crack in the floorboards, filled with a trust he wasn't sure he deserved. John's calloused hands moved with urgent precision, massaging life back into the tiny body cradled against his chest. The cub's fur, now thawing, released an earthy scent mixed with something sharper, ozone and iron, like the air after a lightning strike. Each rib stood out beneath his fingers, the heartbeat fluttering like a trapped moth against its bony cage. The mother creature loomed over them, her massive frame blocking the firelight. Up close, John noticed strange ridges along her spine. Not quite fur, not quite scales, but some impossible hybrid that caught the light like polished onyx. Her breath came in hot gusts that smelled of crushed juniper berries, each exhale ruffling John's hair. "Come on, little warrior," John murmured, rubbing the cub's paws between his palms. The pads were unnaturally textured, not the smooth leather of normal canines, but ridged like fingerprints. Human fingerprints. A wet nose brushed John's wrist. The mother had lowered her head to sniff her offspring, her golden eyes reflecting twin flames from the hearth. When their gazes met, John saw something that made his breath catch. Not just animal instinct, but profound, soulful recognition. Gratitude, the kind that spoke of higher reasoning. Then the firelight caught metal. Beneath the matted fur of her neck, something glinted dully. John reached instinctively, then froze when the mother tensed. Her lips twitched back just enough to reveal those curved canines, longer than any wolf's, slightly serrated along the inner edge. "Easy, girl," John whispered, moving slower now. "Just want to see." The collar was nearly buried in her dense undercoat, the leather so aged it had fused with her skin in places. But the tag? The tag was military-grade steel, its edges worn smooth from years of wear. John's thumbnail scraped away layers of grime and oxidized blood, revealing deeply engraved markings. Project, Cerberus. Specimen, 07 Alpha. If found, call 8669090606. The numbers meant nothing to him. The project name chilled his blood. Cerberus, the three-headed hound that guarded the gates of Hades. John's hands began shaking. He'd heard rumors during his army days, whispers about black site genetic experiments, about Soviet wolf dog hybrids bred for Arctic warfare. But those were campfire stories, conspiracy theories traded over too much vodka. Yet here was living proof pressed against his thigh, her intelligent eyes watching him process the revelation. The cub in his arms whimpered, its tiny claws pricking through his shirt as it regained consciousness. The mother suddenly jerked her head up, ears swiveling toward the ceiling. A low-frequency vibration filled the cabin, not audible so much as felt in the teeth and bones. The other cubs immediately scrambled beneath the kitchen table, their unusual eyes wide with what John could only describe as dread. "What now?" John hissed. The answer came through the storm's wail, a distant but unmistakable thrum of helicopter blades. Getting closer. The mother creature moved with sudden purpose, nudging John toward the back door with her massive head. When he resisted, she clamped down on his sleeve, not biting but insistent, and dragged him toward the root cellar. "No, wait!" John stumbled after her, still cradling the reviving cub. "We can't—" The creature released him and began digging at the cellar door with terrifying efficiency, her claws shredding the old wood like tissue paper. Beneath lay not the empty space John expected, but a gaping black maw, a tunnel that shouldn't exist, its walls smooth as if melted through the permafrost. The message was clear: an escape route, one she'd apparently prepared. The helicopter's sound intensified. Searchlights swept across the cabin windows, turning the falling snow into a strobe effect. John's military training kicked in. That was no civilian chopper. The erratic flight pattern spoke of night operations, of infrared scanners searching for heat signatures. The mother creature stared at John, her golden eyes burning with impossible intensity. Then she did something that shattered his understanding of the natural world. She raised her right forepaw and extended the claws in a deliberate sequence, tapping them against the floor in what could only be described as code. Tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. Morse for G-O. John's mind reeled. This wasn't just some escaped experiment. This was something far more advanced, far more dangerous. The cabin walls vibrated with the approaching helicopter's downdraft. The cub in John's arms wriggled weakly, its unusual eyes, more green than gold, locking onto his with eerie focus. In that moment, John made his choice. He grabbed his emergency pack from the hook, stuffed it with medical supplies and ammunition, then did the unthinkable. He followed the creature into the darkness. The tunnel walls were slick with an odd bioluminescent fungus that provided just enough light to navigate. The air smelled of wet stone and something coppery. John crawled on hands and knees, the revived cub now tucked inside his jacket, its tiny claws pricking his skin with every movement. Behind them, the cabin's front door exploded inward with a crash that shook the very earth above them. Boots pounded across floorboards. A man's voice barked orders in Russian-accented English. "Find them! The tracker says they're—" "Wait, what the hell is this?" The mother creature froze, her fur standing on end. She turned back to John and made a series of rapid clicking sounds with her throat, clearly a warning. Then she surged forward, her massive body moving with impossible speed through the cramped tunnel. John scrambled after her, his mind racing with terrifying questions. Who were these people? What had they created? And most importantly, where was this tunnel leading? The answer came sooner than expected. The tunnel abruptly angled upward, terminating at a circular hatch made of some composite material that didn't match the crude earthen walls. The creature reared up on her hind legs, standing nearly 7 feet tall, and pressed her paw against a hidden panel. With a hiss of hydraulics, the hatch slid open, revealing a blinding swirl of snow and the skeletal outlines of dead spruce trees. They'd emerged nearly a quarter-mile from the cabin, just beyond the tree line where the helicopter couldn't land. John turned back for one last look down the tunnel, just in time to see a flash of movement. A humanoid figure in black tactical gear was crawling after them, its eyes reflecting red in the gloom. Not a man. Something else. Something wrong. The mother creature snarled, a sound that seemed to warp the air itself, then slammed her paw against another hidden control. The hatch sealed with a final-sounding clang, cutting off their pursuer. But John knew this wasn't over. As they fled into the storm-lashed night, one terrible truth became clear. He was no longer the rescuer. He was the rescued. John's thumb rubbed compulsively at the corroded metal tag, his nails splitting as he scraped away decades of grime and oxidized blood. The firelight caught the engraved letters at an angle, making them appear to writhe like living things. Project Cerberus Specimen. 07 Alpha Termination Code. Omega 9. The last line sent an electric jolt down his spine. His military training recognized the format. Black Ops designations used only for assets too dangerous to capture alive. The tag's edges were worn smooth from years of friction against fur and flesh. The leather collar fused to the creature's neck by what appeared to be scar tissue. The mother creature tensed beneath his touch, her golden eyes tracking every micro-expression crossing John's face. She knew what he'd found, understood its significance. The realization settled over John like Arctic fog. This was no escaped pet. This was a manufactured being, and someone had put considerable effort into hunting her down. A wet nose nudged his elbow. The largest cub, the male with those strange black markings, had crept forward to sniff the tag. Up close, John noticed disturbing details. The cub's pupils were vertically slit like a reptile's, contracting and expanding with unnatural precision. When it licked the metal, its tongue was slightly too long, slightly too flexible, ending in a forked tip that left faint double trails in the grime. John's hands began shaking. He'd seen this before. Not in nature, but in a classified briefing during his Special Forces days. Project Chimera, the Soviet Union's attempt to create the perfect cold-weather combatant by splicing human DNA with Arctic wolves. The program had supposedly been abandoned after the 1991 collapse. Yet here was living proof it hadn't. The mother creature suddenly went rigid, her ears swiveling toward the boarded-up kitchen window. A low-frequency vibration pulsed through the cabin. Not sound, but pressure, like the world's largest subwoofer being tested miles away. The sensation made John's fillings ache. The cubs reacted instantly, scrambling beneath the heavy oak table in perfect synchronization. The mother's lips peeled back from those terrifying serrated canines as she positioned herself between John and the door, her hackles raising in a crest that revealed more of those not-quite scales along her spine. Then the night exploded. A concussion wave shattered the remaining window panes, sending glass daggers embedding into the far wall. The oil lamp toppled, its flames snuffing out as kerosene spread across the floorboards in a burning river. In the sudden darkness, John caught glimpses of the mother creature's eyes. They were glowing now, emitting their own faint bioluminescence like deep-sea predators. "Down!" John tackled the nearest cub as a second explosion rocked the cabin's foundation. Plaster rained from the ceiling as he crawled toward his gun cabinet, the mother keeping pace beside him with eerie precision. The Winchester was right where he'd left it, but his fingers hesitated on the stock. Outside, shadows moved with military efficiency, black-clad figures fanning out in a textbook perimeter breach formation. Their movements were wrong, too fluid, too coordinated, like a single mind controlled 6 bodies. The mother creature growled, a sound that started as a canine rumble but descended into something far more primal, vibrating at a frequency that made John's vision blur. The cubs joined in, creating a harmonic resonance that shattered the remaining glass in the picture frames. Then the cabin's front door disintegrated, not from explosives, not from battering, but from what appeared to be concentrated ultrasonic waves. John saw the wood fibers unraveling in real time, like time-lapse footage of rotting fruit. Through the smoke and snow swirled 3 figures in advanced tactical gear, their helmets featuring glowing red optics that swept the room in precise grids. John raised the Winchester, and the mother creature knocked it from his hands with terrifying precision. Her golden eyes locked onto his, pupils dilating until only a thin ring of color remained. The message was clear. Fighting was suicide. The lead intruder stepped forward, removing his helmet to reveal a face that wasn't human. Not entirely. The bone structure was too angular, the canines slightly too pronounced, the eyes reflecting light back at John in that same prismatic way the mother's did. When he spoke, his voice contained harmonics no human larynx could produce. "Return the specimens, Mr. Carter. This doesn't concern you." John's blood turned to ice. They knew his name. The mother creature positioned herself between John and the hybrids, her body language shifting from defensive to something far more unsettling, calculating. Her nostrils flared as she took in the intruder's scent, then made a series of rapid clicking sounds that made the cubs immediately cluster behind the overturned sofa. The lead hybrid's hand went to his belt, unholstering a device that looked like a cross between a taser and a sonar gun. "Last warning, step away from the asset." John's military training screamed at him to comply. His survival instinct told him he'd already seen too much to be allowed to live. But it was the mother creature's next action that decided his course. She turned her head just enough to glance at the root cellar door, then back to John, her golden eyes conveying an unmistakable message. Escape. Now. As the hybrids advanced, John made his choice. He grabbed the nearest cub and dove for the cellar, the mother moving in perfect sync to block their pursuers. The last thing he saw before disappearing into the darkness was her unleashing a sound no earthly creature should make. A sonic pulse that made the very air shimmer, as she bought them precious seconds to flee. The tunnel beneath the cabin was older than John realized, its walls lined with strange glyphs that pulsed faintly in the dark. The cub in his arms trembled, its too warm body radiating fear as distant explosions shook the earth above them. Somewhere ahead in the blackness, the other cubs waited. Somewhere behind, a genetically engineered soldier and his creator fought a battle that defied nature. And John Carter, simple trapper, retired soldier, accidental accomplice, now ran for his life through an underground labyrinth that shouldn't exist, carrying a creature that couldn't exist. The tag's words echoed in his mind with every pounding step. Termination code. Omega 9. He was running headlong into a nightmare older than the Cold War. And the only thing more terrifying than being hunted was beginning to understand why they'd been hunted in the first place. The mother creature's entire body locked into perfect stillness, her breath freezing mid-exhale in a pale cloud that hung suspended in the frigid air. Every muscle beneath her thick pelt stood defined like steel cables, her ears rotating with mechanical precision toward the cabin's eastern wall. John saw the change ripple through her, the way her claws extended reflexively, digging furrows into the hardwood floor, the subtle vibration along her spine, where those strange, not-quite scales caught the firelight. Then came the sound. Not just a truck engine. That would have been ordinary, expected even in this remote wilderness. This was the guttural growl of a military-grade vehicle, its diesel roar muffled by what John's combat experience recognized as sound dampeners. The crunch of snow under heavy boots came next, but all wrong. The footsteps were too synchronized, the weight distribution uneven like the walkers weren't entirely human. The cubs reacted before John could process the danger. The largest male bared tiny serrated teeth in perfect silence, while the two females pressed their bodies flat against the floorboards, their coats shifting color to near-perfect camouflage with the wood grain. John blinked. That shouldn't be possible. Yet in the space between heartbeats, they'd become nearly invisible. Christ, John breathed, reaching instinctively for the Winchester leaning against the hearth. His fingers had barely grazed the cold steel when the mother creature moved faster than his eyes could track. One massive paw pinned the rifle stock to the floor with terrifying precision, her golden eyes burning a warning into his. Outside, metal clicked against metal, the unmistakable sound of rounds being chambered in unison. Then a voice cut through the storm's howl, amplified by some unseen PA system. "John Carter, we know you're harboring classified assets. Open the door, and you won't be harmed." The lie hung thick in the air. John had heard that same measured tone in Afghanistan right before Black Ops teams cleared villages. His palms slicked with sweat despite the cold. These weren't wildlife officials or even regular military. The cadence was all wrong, the phrasing too precise. The mother creature's nostrils flared as she sampled the air currents sneaking through the cabin's cracks. Her reaction was instantaneous, lips peeling back from those terrifying teeth in a silent snarl, hackles rising to reveal the full length of her spinal ridges. Whatever she smelled out there, it triggered something primal in her. John risked a glance through the nearest window's frost-rimmed edge. His gut clenched. 3 armored vehicles formed a perfect triangle around his property, their matte black surfaces absorbing the moonlight rather than reflecting it. The figures moving between them wore Arctic camouflage gear, but their movements, God, their movements were all wrong. Too fluid, too coordinated. Like a single mind controlled 6 bodies. Then one turned its head toward the window. John dropped below the sill, his pulse hammering in his throat. The face had been humanoid but not human. The eyes spaced too wide, the jawline too angular, the skin reflecting light with an almost metallic sheen. When it spoke to its companions, the voice carried that same unnatural harmonic he'd noticed from the mother creature. The cabin's front door shuddered under a single, deliberate knock. The wood groaned in protest, frost crystals shivering from the hinges. "Mr. Carter." The voice was closer now, right outside. "You have 30 seconds to comply before we extract by force." The mother creature moved like liquid shadow, herding the cubs toward the cabin's rear with precise nudges of her muzzle. When she returned to John's side, she did something that stopped his heart. She rose onto her hind legs, standing nearly 7 feet tall, and placed both forepaws against his chest. The claws retracted with conscious control, leaving only padded pressure as she pushed him toward the back wall. Understanding dawned. She knew the cabin's layout better than he did, knew where to run. John grabbed his emergency pack from its hook. Ammunition, medical supplies, the old topographic map his father had marked with secret trails. The mother watched with eerie focus as he loaded the Winchester, her head tilting in apparent approval when he pocketed extra shells. Outside, the countdown reached 15 seconds. A new sound joined the chaos, a high-pitched whine building in intensity, like a capacitor charging. John recognized the tone from his demolitions training. They were preparing a breaching device, something designed to neutralize organic threats upon entry. The mother creature's reaction was instantaneous. She threw back her head and unleashed a sound beyond anything in nature, a pulse wave that shattered the remaining window glass and made the cabin's log walls vibrate. The oil lamp exploded in a shower of kerosene and flame. In the sudden pandemonium, she clamped her jaws gently around John's wrist and pulled. Not enough to break skin, but with irresistible force. John stumbled after her toward the cabin's rear storage closet, a space he knew had no exit. Except the creature knew otherwise. With a powerful swipe of her claws, she tore through the false back wall John had never realized existed, revealing a yawning black tunnel that smelled of damp earth and something coppery. The cubs slipped inside without hesitation, their forms nearly invisible in the darkness. The front door's hinges screamed in protest. "Go!" John hissed, though he knew the mother didn't need translation. She hesitated just long enough to lock eyes with him, that golden gaze conveying something too complex for any animal, then vanished into the tunnel. John followed, pulling the hidden panel shut, just as the cabin's main door exploded inward. The tunnel was narrower than expected, the walls slick with some bioluminescent fungus that provided just enough light to navigate. The air tasted metallic, like licking a battery. John crawled on hands and knees, the Winchester slung across his back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind them, the cabin erupted in shouted commands and the staccato bursts of suppressed gunfire. Then a new sound joined the chaos, a wet, tearing noise followed by screams that didn't sound entirely human. The mother creature paused, her ears swiveling toward the noise, something like satisfaction in her posture. John realized with dawning horror that the tunnel hadn't been her escape plan. It had been her ambush point. The screams cut off abruptly. Silence fell, broken only by the distant whine of the armored vehicles powering up. Then, footsteps, approaching the hidden panel. The mother creature bared her teeth in what might have been a grin and pushed John deeper into the tunnel. The last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed them was the reflection of her eyes in the gloom, glowing now with their own inner light, pupils slit vertically like a predator seeing perfectly in the dark. Somewhere ahead lay answers. Somewhere behind, death walked on 2 legs. and John Carter, caught between them, finally understood one terrible truth. He'd never been the protector in this story. From the very beginning, he'd been the one being protected. John's fingers closed around the Winchester's stock just as the cabin door shuddered under another impact. Splinters flew from the frame, revealing glimpses of black tactical gear through the cracks. The mother creature didn't growl. She vibrated, her entire body emitting a subsonic hum that made John's teeth ache, and the remaining glassware shatter in the kitchen cabinets. The cubs reacted with military precision. The largest male positioned himself at the mother's flank, his two long claws extending with audible clicks. The two females circled behind John, their warm bodies pressing against his legs not in fear, but like soldiers forming a defensive formation. Their coordination was terrifying. This wasn't animal instinct, but trained tactics. "Open up!" Final warning. The voice outside had lost its mechanical calm, now laced with something frantic. John worked the Winchester's lever action by muscle memory, the .3030 cartridge glinting copper in the firelight. His hands were steady. That at least hadn't changed since Afghanistan. What had changed was the awareness thrumming through him. The certainty that the creature standing shoulder to shoulder with him understood exactly what was coming next. The mother's golden eyes met his. Then, with deliberate slowness, she dipped her massive head toward the floorboards near the stove. John followed her gaze and saw what he'd missed before. A nearly invisible seam in the wood, forming a perfect 3-foot square. Another crash at the door. The deadbolt sheared clean off, clattering across the floor. John didn't hesitate. He dropped to his knees and pried at the hidden panel, his fingers finding purchase in nail grooves worn smooth by use. The wood came up with a groan, revealing a yawning black shaft that smelled of damp earth and something metallic. A bolt hole. The mother didn't need prompting. She nudged the cubs toward the opening with urgent whuffs of breath, her eyes never leaving the disintegrating door. The largest male went first, vanishing into the darkness without hesitation. The females followed, their forms blurring at the edges as their coats shifted color to match the shadows, an ability John still couldn't process. The door exploded inward. John caught a glimpse of black helmets, rifle barrels, and strange glowing optics before the mother creature moved. She didn't attack, she blurred, her body becoming a silver streak as she positioned herself between John and the intruders. The first tranq dart meant for John's neck embedded in her shoulder instead. Her reaction was instantaneous. A sound like 1,000 angry hornets filled the cabin as she vibrated at a frequency that made the air shimmer. The dart disintegrated before the sedative could discharge. The commandos stumbled back, their movements suddenly uncoordinated. Whatever tech enhanced them couldn't compensate for whatever the mother was doing. "Go!" John shouted, though the creature already knew. She backed toward the opening, her body now glowing faintly along those strange spinal ridges. John followed, Winchester at the ready. The lead commando recovered first, bringing his weapon up, some hybrid between a rifle and sonic emitter. John fired from the hip. The .3030 round struck the weapon's housing, sending up a shower of sparks. The mother seized the moment, unleashing a pulse from her vibrating body that shattered every remaining window outward in a deadly hail. In the chaos, John dropped into the shaft, the mother following so close her fur brushed his face. The panels slammed shut above them just as stun grenades detonated in the cabin. The shockwave rattled John's teeth, but the earth absorbed most of the impact. Complete darkness enveloped them, until the mother's ridges began glowing with that same eerie bioluminescence, revealing a tunnel that sloped sharply downward. The cubs waited a dozen yards ahead, their eyes reflecting the light in prismatic bursts. John crawled forward, the Winchester scraping against the narrow walls. The air grew colder as they descended, the walls transitioning from packed earth to smooth stone carved with strange symbols, that pulsed faintly in sync with the mother's glow. Distant thumps echoed from above, the commandos searching for the hidden entrance. They'd find it soon. The mother seemed to know this, her pace quickening as the tunnel curved sharply left. John's knees ached against the unyielding stone, his breath coming in ragged gasps that fogged in the suddenly frigid air. Then the tunnel ended. Abruptly. One moment John was crawling, the next he was staring into a vertical shaft that dropped away into blackness. The mother stopped at the edge, her glow intensifying to reveal the truth. This was no mere bolt hole. The shaft walls were lined with metallic rungs descending into darkness. Ancient rungs, their surfaces worn smooth by generations of use. The mother nudged the nearest cub, who gripped a rung in its two dexterous paws and began descending with simian ease. The others followed. John hesitated. This was no animal den. This was infrastructure. A crash echoed from the tunnel behind them. The commandos had breached the entrance. The mother's eyes locked onto John's, glowing brighter than ever. In their depths, John saw something that chilled him more than the yawning shaft. Recognition. This wasn't new to her. She gripped his sleeve in her teeth and tugged toward the drop. The message was clear: jump or die. John swung his legs over the edge, his boots finding the first rung just as muzzle flashes lit the tunnel behind them. The mother positioned herself above him, her body blocking the bullets that ricocheted harmlessly off her armored ridges. Down they climbed, into darkness so complete even the mother's glow couldn't penetrate it. The air grew thick with the scent of ozone and wet stone. John's arms burned with the effort, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Then, a sound from below. The cubs had reached bottom and were calling up in those strange harmonic tones. The mother answered, her voice vibrating through the shaft walls. John's boot finally touched solid ground just as the world above exploded in a concussive roar, the commandos destroying the tunnel entrance rather than follow. Dust rained down as the mother landed beside him, her glow revealing their surroundings in pulses. They stood in a circular chamber, the walls lined with more of those pulsating glyphs. But what stole John's breath was the massive metal door at the chamber's far end. A door marked with the same symbol as the mother's collar tag. Cerberus. The mother pressed her paw against a nearly invisible panel. The door hissed open, revealing a corridor lit with the same eerie bioluminescence. The cubs darted inside, their forms blurring at the edges, as their camouflage adapted to the new environment. John hesitated at the threshold. This was no escape. This was entering the beast's lair. The mother nudged him forward, her golden eyes reflecting the corridor's glow. Behind them, rubble shifted as the commandos began clearing the collapse. Ahead lay answers to questions John wasn't sure he wanted to ask. The Winchester felt suddenly inadequate in his hands as he stepped across the threshold. The door sealed behind them with a final sounding clang, cutting off the surface world completely. John Carter, decorated veteran and survival expert, had just walked willingly into an underground facility that shouldn't exist, led by creatures that defied nature. And as the corridor lights pulsed in time with the mother's breathing, one terrible truth became clear. They'd wanted him to find that collar tag all along. The cabin's front door trembled under another impact, its reinforced hinges screaming in protest. John's combat-honed instincts assessed the situation in milliseconds. The tactical team outside would breach within 30 seconds. His gaze locked onto the mother creature's luminous golden eyes, seeing his own reflection distorted in their prismatic depths. "We have to run." The words left John's lips barely above a whisper, yet the creature's ears swiveled forward with perfect comprehension. A terrifying intelligence flashed behind those alien eyes as she swung her massive head toward the cubs. Without hesitation, she clamped her jaws around the scruff of the nearest, not with crushing force, but with surgical precision that avoided breaking skin. The other two cubs immediately fell into formation behind her. their movements too disciplined, too coordinated for normal animals. John moved first, snatching his emergency pack from the hook near the wood stove. His fingers brushed the leather-bound journal his grandfather had kept. A lifetime of wilderness knowledge in those pages. He hesitated only a heartbeat before stuffing it into the pack alongside ammunition and medical supplies. The mother creature was already at the rear window, her body positioned at an unnatural angle to shield the cubs from potential gunfire. John noticed how her paws flexed against the floorboards, not just claws extending, but the actual bone structure subtly reshaping to provide better traction. The sight sent ice water trickling down his spine. Another crash at the front door. Closer now. John threw the window latch just as the cabin's overhead lights exploded in a shower of sparks. Someone outside had cut the power. Moonlight streamed through the swirling snow, painting the mother creature's silvered fur in monochrome. She didn't wait for permission. With impossible grace for her size, she launched through the narrow opening, her body twisting midair to protect the cub in her jaws. The remaining cubs followed in perfect sync, their small forms blurring at the edges as their camouflage activated. John went last, his boots crunching into knee-deep snow. The cold hit like a physical blow, stealing his breath in a white plume. The mother creature was already moving, her massive paws leaving bizarre tracks. Not the usual canine pattern, but something closer to a cross between wolf and primate prints. "John Carter!" The amplified voice from the cabin carried an edge of mechanical distortion. "You're making a mistake." The mother froze at the sound, her entire body vibrating with that subsonic hum John had come to recognize as a precursor to violence. The snow around her paws began melting in perfect geometric patterns, forming fractal-like designs in the moonlight. John didn't wait to see what came next. He grabbed the nearest cub, the smallest female, and tucked her against his chest beneath his parka. Her body heat was unnatural, like holding a furnace against his ribs. The mother gave a sharp nod, a human gesture that had no business on an animal's face, and surged forward into the tree line. The forest swallowed them whole. Ancient spruce trees formed a natural barrier, their snow-laden branches bending under the storm's fury. John followed the mother's glowing spinal ridges like a beacon, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind them, the cabin erupted in shouted commands and the staccato bursts of suppressed gunfire. Then the world turned white. The concussion wave lifted John off his feet, slamming him into a snowdrift. The cub in his parka yelped, but remained secured. Through ringing ears, he heard the mother creature's answering snarl, a sound that shouldn't have been possible without vocal cords. The cabin was gone. In its place, a column of fire reached into the night sky, illuminating the commandos' silhouettes as they fanned out with thermal goggles. John scrambled to his knees just as the mother creature loomed over him, her golden eyes reflecting the inferno. Up close, he saw the damage. 3 darts embedded in her flank, their sedative reservoirs still half full. She'd somehow prevented them from discharging. She nudged him forward with her muzzle, her breath smelling of ozone and copper. The message was clear: run or die. The forest became a nightmare tableau of shadows and firelight. John's military training took over, his body moving on autopilot while his mind raced. These weren't ordinary hunters. Their tactics, their tech, their unnatural movements spoke of something far more dangerous. The mother creature suddenly changed direction, herding them toward a rocky outcropping John had never noticed before. As they drew closer, he saw why. The boulders formed a perfect semicircle around what appeared to be a natural cave entrance. Except nothing about this was natural. The cave mouth was too symmetrical, its edges lined with the same strange metal as the mother's collar tag. The cubs slipped inside without hesitation, their forms blurring into the darkness. John hesitated at the threshold. The mother creature turned, her eyes locking onto his. In that moment, he saw something that chilled him more than the Arctic cold: calculation. This hadn't been random. She'd led them here deliberately. A bullet whined off the rocks nearby, spurring John into motion. He ducked inside just as the mother unleashed another of those sonic pulses toward their pursuers. The cave walls absorbed the vibration, humming in resonance. The passage sloped downward, the air growing warmer with each step. Bioluminescent fungi lined the walls, their pulsating glow revealing carved symbols matching those on the mother's ridges. John's fingers traced one. It was warm to the touch, vibrating at the same frequency as the creature beside him. Deeper they went, the passage widening into a tunnel system that smelled of ozone and wet stone. The cubs moved with purpose now, their paws finding hidden pressure plates that illuminated their path in eerie blue light. John's boot suddenly struck something metallic. He looked down to find a rusted service hatch half buried in the earth, its surface marked with the same Cerberus symbol. The mother creature nudged it open with her muzzle, revealing a vertical shaft descending into darkness. The cubs went first, climbing down with simian dexterity. The mother waited until John had secured his pack before following, her massive body somehow fitting through the narrow opening. As John began his descent, he caught one last glimpse of the surface, flashing lights, distorted shouts, and the silhouette of something that didn't move like a man watching from the tree line. Then the hatch sealed above them with a hiss of hydraulics, plunging them into the earth's embrace. The rungs beneath John's hands were cold and strangely textured, not metal, but something organic fused with machinery. The mother creature's glow intensified below him, revealing the truth in pulses of golden light. This was no animal den. This was a facility. And they'd wanted him to find it all along. The blizzard swallowed them whole. One moment John was standing in the cave entrance. The next, the world became a howling white nightmare. Snow lashed his face like broken glass, the wind stealing his breath before it could fog in the air. He blinked against the stinging cold, and when his eyes opened, the mother creature had vanished into the storm's fury. A muzzle flash illuminated the tree line behind them. The gunshot reached John a half-second later, the round splitting the night air where his head had been. Instinct took over. He dropped into a crouch, the smallest cub still pressed against his chest beneath his parka. Its rapid heartbeat thrummed against his ribs like a trapped bird. "John Carter!" The distorted voice cut through the storm's wail. "You don't understand what you're carrying!" Another shot. Closer this time. Snow exploded to John's left where the round impacted. He rolled behind a fallen spruce, its trunk wide enough to provide temporary cover. His fingers found the Winchester's action, frozen shut. The temperature had dropped so fast the oil in the mechanism had turned to glue. A shadow moved against the blizzard's chaos, the mother creature materializing like a ghost. Her golden eyes glowed faintly through the whiteout, her fur now standing erect in a way that disrupted her silhouette. Not just camouflage, active distortion. The snow seemed to bend around her as if repelled by some invisible field. She clamped her jaws around John's sleeve and pulled. Not toward the deeper forest as he expected, but parallel to the cabin's burning remains. A feint, a tactical retreat. John followed, his boots plunging through the snow's crust with each step. The cub in his parka squirmed, its too warm body radiating heat that should have been impossible for something so small. Behind them, the commandos' shouts grew more frantic, their thermal scopes useless against whatever energy the mother creature emitted. The storm intensified with unnatural speed. Wind velocities doubled within minutes, the snowfall thickening until John could barely see his own outstretched hand. This wasn't normal weather. It reacted to their movements, swirling in precise patterns that obscured their trail. The mother creature slowed as they reached a frozen creek bed. Her paws tested the ice with deliberate care before leading them across. Halfway over, she stopped abruptly, her entire body tensing. John barely had time to react before she bodily shoved him behind a boulder. Not a second too soon. A shape materialized from the blizzard. One of the commandos, but wrong. His movements were jerky, spasmodic. His helmet visor cracked to reveal milky white eyes that saw without seeing. Blood dripped from his nose and ears, freezing instantly into crimson icicles. He clutched his rifle like a talisman, muttering in a language that made John's teeth ache. The mother creature's reaction was instantaneous. She stepped into full view, her spinal ridges flaring to emit a low-frequency pulse. The commando's head snapped toward her, his mouth opening in a silent scream. Then, horrifyingly, his body began folding in on itself, joints bending backward, bones audibly cracking as he collapsed into a twitching heap. John's stomach lurched. Whatever she'd done, it hadn't just killed the man, it had rewritten his anatomy in seconds. The mother didn't pause to let John process. She nudged him forward, her eyes now burning brighter than ever. The cub in his parka whined, its tiny claws pricking his skin through the fabric. They ran. The forest became a labyrinth of shadows and ice. John's lungs burned with each frigid breath, his muscles screaming in protest. Yet the mother creature moved with effortless grace, her paws leaving barely an impression in the snow. Every 100 yards she'd stop, tilt her head as if listening to something beyond human hearing, then adjust their course. At one such pause, John noticed the trees around them bore strange markings. Not claw scratches, but precise glyphs carved at exact intervals. The mother touched her nose to each one as they passed, making the symbols briefly glow the same gold as her eyes. The blizzard responded in kind. Wind patterns shifted. Snow accumulated in deliberate drifts that obscured their trail. The temperature fluctuated in precise waves, warmer in their path, colder behind them to confuse thermal tracking. This wasn't escape. This was orchestrated evasion. A new sound cut through the storm, not gunfire, but something deeper. A rhythmic thumping that vibrated in John's molars. Helicopters, multiple. Their searchlights cut swaths through the snowfall, illuminating patches of forest in stark relief. The mother creature bared her teeth in what might have been a smile. She led them to a deadfall. A tangle of spruce trunks collapsed against a granite outcrop. To John's eyes, it appeared impenetrable. But when the mother touched a specific sequence of knots on the largest log, the entire mass shifted, revealing a hidden passage slick with ice. The cub slipped inside without hesitation. John followed, his shoulders barely clearing the narrow opening. The mother came last, sealing the entrance behind them with a nudge of her muzzle. Complete darkness enveloped them, for exactly 3 heartbeats. Then the mother's spinal ridges ignited with golden light, revealing they stood in a tunnel of ancient ice. Not a natural formation. The walls were too smooth, the ceiling too perfectly arched. Etched into the glacial blue were more of those symbols, these ones pulsing in time with the mother's breathing. The cubs moved with purpose now, their paws finding traction on the slick surface. John's boots, by contrast, slipped with every step until the mother nudged him toward the wall. Understanding, he let his gloved fingers trail along the ice and gasped. It wasn't cold. The tunnel walls radiated gentle warmth, their surfaces thrumming with energy. Where John touched them, the symbols brightened momentarily, as if recognizing his presence. Deeper they went, the passage descending in a gradual spiral. The helicopter sounds faded, replaced by an eerie silence broken only by the occasional drip of meltwater. John's breath came easier here. The air smelled crisp and clean, with an undertone of ozone. After what felt like miles, the tunnel opened into a cavern that stole John's breath. The ice here formed a perfect dome, its apex open to the night sky where the blizzard still raged. Moonlight filtered through the storm, refracting off countless embedded crystals to illuminate the space in shimmering blues and golds. At the chamber's center stood a structure that made John's pulse stutter. A raised dais of black stone, its surface carved with intricate patterns that matched the mother's collar tag. Cerberus. The mother creature ascended the dais with reverent steps, her cubs forming a precise triangle around her. When she turned to face John, her eyes held something beyond animal intelligence, something ancient and knowing. The chamber's crystals brightened in unison, projecting images onto the ice walls. A military complex buried in Arctic permafrost. Rows of containment cells holding creatures like the mother. A man in a lab coat injecting something glowing into a wolf's spine. The images shifted faster. Experiments, escapes, massacres. A timeline of horrors spanning decades. John saw his own cabin flash by, saw the mother creature watching him from the tree line weeks before their first meeting. Saw her deliberately leading her cubs into his path during the storm. This hadn't been chance. This had been a plan decades in the making. The projection froze on a single image, a genetic map comparing human and wolf DNA, with a third strand woven between them. A strand that matched the mother's unique markers. John's legs gave out. He collapsed to his knees as the truth crashed over him. The Cerberus Project hadn't been trying to create weapons. They'd been trying to recreate something far older. And they'd succeeded. The ancient spruce trees formed a skeletal cathedral around them, their snow-laden branches groaning under the storm's relentless assault. John's breath came in ragged gasps, each exhale crystallizing instantly in the -40 degrees Fahrenheit air. The cub's whimpers had grown weaker over the past mile, not from exhaustion, but from something deeper. A slowing, a fading. The mother creature halted so abruptly John nearly collided with her. Her massive frame blocked the trail, her spinal ridges flaring open to reveal bioluminescent veins that pulsed an eerie blue in the darkness. The snow around her paws began melting in perfect geometric patterns, hexagonal fractals that spread outward with mathematical precision. Before them, the frozen river stretched into the blizzard's heart. John had crossed this tributary 100 times in better weather, a narrow band of ice no more than 30 feet across. Tonight, it looked like something from another world. The surface gleamed mirror-smooth under the storm's intermittent moonlight, so clear John could see shadowy shapes moving beneath. Not fish. Larger. Much larger. The mother creature's nostrils flared as she tested the air. Her golden eyes reflected the ice's unnatural glow as she turned to assess her cubs. The smallest, the female with one white paw, was trembling violently, her breath coming in shallow pants. When John reached to steady her, the cub's fur burned his bare fingers. Not fever hot, something worse. Nuclear. "Christ!" John hissed, shaking his hand. The cub whimpered an apology, her two intelligent eyes pooling with liquid gold. A new sound cut through the storm's wail, a mechanical whine growing steadily closer. Snowmobiles, at least 3 by the pitch. The mother creature's ears swiveled backward, her lips peeling away from those serrated canines in a silent snarl. John dropped to one knee beside the weakest cub. "We have to cross. Now!" The mother shook her massive head violently, spraying melted snow in an arc. She stepped to the river's edge and extended one claw, tapping the ice in a complex rhythm. The frozen surface answered with a harmonic vibration that traveled up John's boots into his bones. Then he saw it. The ice wasn't uniformly thick. Beneath its pristine surface, fractures formed a spiderweb of glowing blue lines. Not random cracks, but deliberate patterns. Ancient patterns. The same symbols carved into the mother's collar tag. One of the cubs, the bold male with black markings, crept forward and pressed his paw against the ice. The fractures beneath flared brighter, illuminating what lay below. Shapes. Dozens of them. Sleek, elongated shadows circling just beneath the surface, each easily the size of a grown man, their movements too fluid, too purposeful for any Arctic predator John knew. The mother creature growled low in her throat, the sound making the ice vibrate. The shapes below changed course instantly, moving to form a perfect circle beneath their position. The snowmobile engines grew louder, closer. John unslung his frozen Winchester, working the action with numb fingers. The mother gave him a look that bordered on pity before nudging the rifle downward with her muzzle. She touched her nose to the ice, then to John's chest, her meaning clear: "Trust me." Then she stepped onto the frozen river. The ice should have cracked under her weight, should have sent them all plunging into the killing cold. Instead, the glowing fractures rearranged themselves, forming a dense latticework that thickened where her paws touched. The cubs followed without hesitation, their small bodies leaving faint trails of bioluminescence in their wake. John's combat-honed instincts screamed at him to find another way. But the snowmobile headlights were visible now, wavering beams cutting through the storm's chaos. He stepped onto the ice. The world changed. The river's surface became suddenly frictionless, yet John's boots adhered perfectly with each step. The glowing fractures pulsed in time with his heartbeat, the strange shapes below keeping pace beneath them. A high-pitched whine built in his ears, not from the approaching snowmobiles, but from the ice itself. A vibration that made his teeth ache and his vision blur at the edges. Halfway across, the mother froze. Her head snapped toward the shore they'd just left. John followed her gaze and felt his blood turn to ice. 3 figures stood at the tree line. Not commandos. These wore no Arctic gear, just simple gray parkas that flapped in the wind. Their faces were indistinct, but their stance was all wrong. Joints bent at impossible angles, heads tilted too far to one side. One raised an arm to point at John, the limb extending farther than human anatomy should allow. The mother creature unleashed a sound beyond description, a frequencies hattering pulse that made the entire river vibrate. The ice beneath the figure's feet exploded upward in crystalline spikes, impaling all 3 simultaneously. No blood spilled, only a thick, iridescent fluid that steamed where it hit the snow. John didn't have time to process what he'd seen. The remaining cubs were faltering, their glowing fur dimming by the second. The mother nudged them forward urgently, her eyes locking onto John's with desperate intensity. The far shore beckoned, a sheer rock face that should have been insurmountable. But as they neared, the ice flow carried them toward what John had mistaken for a shadow. A tunnel, perfectly round, deliberately carved. The snowmobiles reached the opposite bank just as the mother creature herded her cubs into the opening. John dove in after them, his parka scraping against the tunnel's unnaturally smooth walls. Behind them, the ice bridge disintegrated in a shower of prismatic shards, taking the pursuers with it. Darkness enveloped them, then light, soft, blue, and pulsing from the walls themselves. The tunnel sloped upward, its surface slick with something that wasn't quite ice, wasn't quite glass. John's boots slipped, but the mother creature braced him with her body, her warmth unnatural against his side. The cubs moved slower now, their energy fading. The smallest collapsed, her breathing alarmingly slow. John gathered her into his arms, shocked at how light she felt, as if her bones were hollow. The mother nuzzled her offspring, then did something unimaginable. She opened her jaws wide and exhaled a stream of golden particles over the cub. The tiny creature gasped, her body arching as the light was absorbed through her fur. Her siblings crowded close, sharing the energy between them in a display of biology that defied every law John knew. The tunnel ended at a circular door. Not metal, not wood. Something organic, veined with glowing capillaries that pulsed in time with the mother's breathing. She pressed her paw against its center, and the veins brightened, forming a symbol John recognized from the cave drawings of indigenous tribes. The Guardian. The door dilated open, revealing a chamber that stole John's breath. Walls of living ice curved upward into darkness, their surfaces etched with thousands of interconnected symbols. At the room's center stood a dais of black stone, upon which rested 7 crystalline pods, 6 empty, 1 shattered. The mother approached the broken one, her whine echoing through the chamber with palpable grief. John understood instantly. This was no military facility. This was a tomb, and the mother creature had just brought her cubs home. The frozen river exhaled beneath them. A deep, resonant groan echoed through the ice as John took another cautious step forward, the surface flexing like living tissue beneath his boots. Not the sharp crack of impending disaster, but something far stranger, an almost vocal protest from the ancient water below. The mother creature paused mid-stride, her massive paws splayed wide to distribute weight, her golden eyes reflecting the eerie blue light emanating from the fractures beneath them. The cubs moved in single file behind her, their tiny bodies leaving faint phosphorescent trails across the ice. The smallest, the white-pawed female, lagged behind, her breathing labored. John watched in horrified fascination as her fur dimmed and brightened in irregular pulses, like a dying bulb. Then it happened. A section of ice the cub was crossing shimmered suddenly, its crystalline structure rearranging into something glass-smooth. Her claws found no purchase. With a terrified yip, she slid sideways, her hindquarters breaking through the weakened surface. John lunged instinctively, but the mother was faster. Her body moved with impossible precision, not the lunge of a predator, but something more akin to liquid metal flowing into a mold. One moment she stood poised on the ice. The next, she had the cub's scruff clamped gently in her jaws, while her forepaws braced against the fracturing surface. The ice screamed in protest, jagged lines racing outward from the impact point in perfect geometric patterns. John dropped flat, spreading his weight as the river convulsed beneath them. The remaining cubs scrambled to his side, their tiny claws extending in unison to grip his parka. Through the now transparent ice, John saw movement. Those massive, sleek shadows from before converging directly below the break. The mother creature hauled her cub back onto solid ice just as the entire rear section of their path disintegrated. But this was no ordinary collapse. The shards didn't sink. They hung suspended in midair, vibrating at a frequency that made John's vision blur. The shadows beneath the surface circled faster, their elongated forms briefly pressing against the ice from below, as if studying the intruders. Then the ice began reforming itself. John blinked snow from his lashes, certain his eyes were deceiving him. The shattered fragments didn't merely refreeze, they flowed back together like mercury, the cracks sealing with audible snaps. The glowing fractures rearranged into new, more complex patterns that pulsed in time with the mother's ragged breathing. She stood trembling over her rescued cub, her fur now standing fully erect in a way that disrupted the very air around her. Snowflakes bent around an invisible field, creating a shimmering halo of distorted space. The cub beneath her shook violently, its fur matted with freezing water that shouldn't have been able to penetrate its supernatural coat. John crawled forward, his medical training overriding his terror. "Let me see her." The mother hesitated only a second before stepping back, her glowing eyes never leaving John's hands as he examined the cub. The tiny creature's pulse fluttered like a hummingbird's, her body temperature fluctuating wildly between feverish and hypothermic. Most alarming were her paws. The normally dexterous digits were stiffening, the flesh turning an unnatural blue-gray at the tips. "Frostbite," John muttered, more to himself than the mother. But even as he said it, he knew that wasn't quite right. This wasn't tissue death from cold. It looked more like petrification. The cub's flesh was quite literally turning to stone. The mother creature whimpered deep in her throat, a sound so profoundly human it raised gooseflesh along John's arms. She nudged the cub with her nose, then turned those luminous eyes on John with desperate intensity. A gunshot shattered the night. The round sparked off the ice 3 feet to John's left, sending up a plume of crystalline shards. He spun toward shore, his frozen Winchester useless in his numb hands. Through the swirling snow, dark figures advanced along the riverbank. Not the gray-suited entities from before, but black-clad commandos moving with that same unnatural coordination. Their thermal scopes glowed like demon eyes in the storm. The mother creature reacted instantly. She threw back her head and unleashed a pulse wave that made the very air shimmer. The advancing figures staggered as their electronics shorted out in sprays of sparks. But more kept coming, their numbers impossible to determine in the blizzard's chaos. John gathered the injured cub against his chest, its weight alarmingly light. "We have to move. Now." The remaining cubs formed up around them as the mother took point, her body now glowing faintly along those strange spinal ridges. She stepped onto the newly reformed ice bridge, testing each placement with deliberate care. The surface held, but the glowing fractures now formed warning symbols John's hindbrain recognized as danger, even if his conscious mind didn't understand them. Halfway across, the ice began singing. A haunting, atonal hum vibrated up through their feet, making John's teeth ache. The cubs whimpered and pressed closer, their ears flattening. The mother creature paused, her head tilting as if listening to some hidden message in the sound. When she moved again, her path changed, no longer straight across, but following a specific pattern of glowing fractures that lit up only as she stepped on them. John followed exactly in her footsteps, the injured cub's breath hot against his neck. Behind them, the commandos reached the broken section of ice. Their leader, a hulking figure with a misshapen silhouette, stepped onto the surface without hesitation. The river exploded. A geyser of supercooled water erupted beneath the man, flash freezing around his body in an instant crystalline tomb. His scream cut off abruptly as the ice encased him completely, his final expression of terror preserved in perfect clarity. The remaining men opened fire blindly, their rounds punching holes in the ice that sealed instantly. John didn't wait to see more. He ran, the cubs keeping pace beside him in perfect formation. The far shore loomed closer, a sheer rock face that offered no obvious escape. Yet the mother creature charged straight toward it, her glow intensifying with each stride. At the last possible second, the ice beneath her paws flared blindingly bright. A hidden channel opened, not in the rock, but in the ice itself, revealing a downward spiral staircase carved from living frost. The mother didn't hesitate. She plunged into the opening, the cubs following without question. John stood frozen at the threshold, the injured cub trembling in his arms. From behind came the sounds of more boots on ice, more weapons being readied. Before him yawned an ancient passage that defied all logic. The mother's golden eyes flashed from the darkness below, not pleading, not commanding, simply waiting to see what he would choose. John took one last look at the world he knew, a world of gunfire and snow and men who hunted things they didn't understand, and stepped into the ice. The staircase sealed shut behind him with a sound like 1,000 panes of glass breaking in reverse. The last thing John saw before darkness took them was the injured cub's paws. The stone-like patches were receding, her flesh returning to normal wherever the strange blue light touched. Somewhere in the depths below, something ancient stirred, and it knew they were coming. The first rays of dawn pierced the storm's remnants like golden spears, transforming the frozen wasteland into a glittering expanse of diamonds. The blizzard had exhausted itself in the night, leaving behind an eerie silence so profound John could hear the blood rushing in his ears. He knelt in the snow, his muscles trembling not from cold, but from the sheer impossibility of their survival. The mother creature stood a few yards away, her silvered fur catching the morning light in prismatic bursts. Her sides heaved with exertion, steam rising from her body in curling tendrils. The cubs huddled around her, their tiny forms trembling as she methodically tended to each of them. Her tongue, rough yet precise, worked over their frost-bitten paws with care that bordered on ritualistic. Where she licked, The unnatural blue-gray petrification receded, their flesh returning to its normal state in slow, visible waves. John watched, transfixed, as the smallest cub, the one he'd held against his chest, lifted its head and locked eyes with him. Its golden irises swirled with intelligence far beyond any animal's, reflecting not just light, but something deeper: recognition, gratitude. Then the mother turned to him. Her gaze held his, unblinking, as she crossed the distance between them. For a heartbeat, John tensed, instincts honed by a lifetime in the wild screaming at him to brace for danger. But she stopped just short of touching him, her breath warm against his frozen skin. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered her massive head and pressed her forehead to his. A jolt of energy surged through him. Images flooded John's mind, not memories, but something more visceral. A vast tundra untouched by time. A pack of creatures like her, their forms shimmering between wolf and something far older. The rise of human civilizations, their fear and violence pushing her kind deeper into hiding. The Cerberus Project, not as creators but as thieves, digging up secrets they were never meant to possess. And then, clearest of all, her escape. The years spent watching from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reclaim what was stolen. John gasped as the connection broke, staggering back as if struck. His hands shook, his mind struggling to reconcile what he'd just witnessed. The mother creature didn't move to steady him. She simply watched, her golden eyes filled with something ancient and sorrowful. A sound shattered the moment, a distant engine, struggling through the deep snow. The hunters weren't giving up. The mother's ears flattened, her body tensing. But this time, there was no fear in her posture, only resolve. She turned to her cubs and issued a series of soft clicks and whines, commands in a language John couldn't understand but instinctively recognized as more than animal. The cubs fell into formation, their earlier exhaustion replaced by alert readiness. Then she looked back at John. And for the first time, she spoke. Not in words, not in sounds any human throat could replicate, but in a vibration that resonated in his bones, carrying meaning as clearly as if she'd whispered in his ear, "You are packed now." The truth of it settled over him like a physical weight. He'd stepped into a war older than recorded history, a battle between what humanity had forgotten and what it had tried to steal. And now, whether he wanted it or not, he was part of it. The engine noise grew louder. The mother creature didn't wait for his response. She turned and led her cubs toward the tree line, her gait steady and sure. But this time she paused at the edge of the forest and glanced back, not in question, but in invitation. John hesitated. Behind him lay the ruins of his old life, the burned-out cabin, the men who would never stop hunting, the world that had never truly understood him. Ahead lay something wild and ancient, a truth buried beneath ice and time. The choice should have been harder. With one last look at the dawn-lit ruins of his past, John Carter shouldered his pack, adjusted the frozen Winchester at his back, and followed the mother creature into the trees. The forest swallowed them whole, and the snow, pristine and untouched, bore no trace of their passing. The forest exhaled around them, its snow-laden branches sagging under the weight of their silence. John knelt in the trampled snow, his fingers numb around the Winchester's stock. The adrenaline that had carried him through the night was fading, leaving behind a hollow ache in his bones. The mother creature stood motionless before him, her golden eyes reflecting the pale morning light in fractured shards. "They'll never stop," John murmured, his voice raw. "Not now that they've seen you." The words hung between them, crystallizing in the frigid air. Somewhere beyond the trees, a branch snapped. Too loud, too deliberate. The hunters were regrouping. The mother creature didn't react to the sound. Her gaze remained locked on John, her breath steaming in slow, measured gusts. The cubs huddled at her flank, their earlier vigor dulled by exhaustion. The smallest one, The white-pawed female limped forward and pressed her muzzle into John's palm. Her fur burned against his skin, not with fever, but with something deeper. A connection. John swallowed hard. You have to go. Far away. The mother's ears twitched. For a heartbeat, the forest itself seemed to still. Then, with agonizing slowness, she lowered her massive head until her forehead rested against John's chest. The contact sent a jolt through him. Not pain, but a surge of images more vivid than any dream. A chain of mountains untouched by human maps, their peaks veiled in perpetual mist. A cavern system pulsing with the same blue light as her veins, its walls carved with symbols older than language. Others of her kind, their forms shifting like quicksilver between wolf and shadow, and something else entirely. The vision shattered as she pulled away, leaving John gasping. Her eyes held a question. A gunshot rang out closer this time. The cubs startled, their fur bristling with static energy. The mother's response was instantaneous, a subvocal growl that made the snow tremble at their feet. The trees beyond their little clearing shivered, their branches dipping unnaturally to obscure the fading gunshot's echo. John's hands clenched. He'd spent a lifetime surviving in this wilderness, but what she'd just shown him existed beyond any terrain he knew. "You can't take me with you," he said hoarsely. The mother blinked, once. A deliberate human gesture. Then she turned and nipped at the largest cub's scruff. The young male resisted at first, his strange slit-pupiled eyes fixed on John. With a sharp whine, he darted forward and clamped his teeth, gently, around John's wrist. Not to drag him, to taste him. The mother watched this exchange with eerie focus. When the cub released John and trotted back to her side, she exhaled sharply through her nostrils, a sound almost like resignation. Another gunshot. Closer. A voice shouted orders in that same mechanically distorted tone. They were being flanked. The mother creature stepped back, her body language shifting into something taut and ready. She nudged the cubs into motion, herding them toward a dense thicket of spruce. At the last possible second, she turned and locked eyes with John once more. This time, the image she projected was unmistakable. A single oak tree, its trunk split by lightning. A hollow at its base. A rifle wrapped in oilcloth. John's breath caught. She wasn't just showing him a hiding place. She was giving him coordinates. A location. A when. The cubs vanished into the underbrush without a sound. The mother hesitated a heartbeat longer, her gaze lingering on John's face as if memorizing every line. Then, with a final pulse of golden light from her spinal ridges, she turned and melted into the forest. One moment she was there. The next, gone. The sudden absence hit John like a physical blow. The clearing felt colder without her presence, the dawn light harsher. His chest ached with something deeper than exhaustion. Boots crunched through snow. John spun, bringing the Winchester up on instinct. 3 figures emerged from the trees. Not the black-clad commandos this time, but men in standard-issue winter camo. Their leader, a grizzled man with a scar bisecting his eyebrow, lowered his rifle slightly at the sight of John. "Carter?" The man's voice was rough but human. "Jesus, we thought you were dead." John didn't relax his grip on the Winchester. "Who's we?" "Fairbanks PDSAR team." The man gestured to his companions. "We got a tip about illegal activity out here. Found your cabin burned to the ground." His eyes narrowed. "You want to tell us what the hell happened?" John glanced at the spot where the mother creature had vanished. The snow there was unmarked, as if she'd never existed. He exhaled slowly. "Bear attack," he said, the lie tasting like ash. "Biggest damn grizzly I've ever seen." The leader studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Let's get you home." As they led him away, John risked one last look over his shoulder. Deep in the shadows of the spruce grove, a single pair of golden eyes glowed back at him. Then, with a final flicker, they winked out. The snowmobile ride back to civilization passed in a blur. The SAR team asked questions John answered with half-truths, their skepticism palpable, but their concern genuine. By the time they reached the ranger station, his story was set in stone. A rogue bear, a tragic fire, a night spent surviving in the wilderness. They bought it, or pretended to. As John sat in the station's cramped medical bay, a grainy news report played on the corner TV. Break-in at the University of Alaska's Northern Research Facility. Officials report several experimental subjects unaccounted for. The screen cut to static before the newscaster could finish. John stared at his reflection in the blackened screen. The face looking back was his own, yet changed. His eyes, once a flat Arctic blue, now held faint golden flecks at the edges of the irises. He flexed his hands. The frostbite that should have blackened his fingers was already healing at an impossible rate. Some bonds, it seemed, couldn't be broken by distance. And some hunts never truly ended. The forest held its breath as the mother creature paused at the tree line. Dawn's pale light gilded her silvered fur, transforming her into a spectral figure, both timeless and ephemeral. She turned one last time, her golden eyes capturing the morning sun and fracturing it into prismatic shards that danced across the snow. John stood rooted in place, the Winchester hanging slack at his side. His chest ached with a hollow pressure, as if something vital had been carved out and taken with her. The cubs lingered behind their mother, their forms already blurring at the edges as the forest's shadows embraced them. The bold male, the one who had tasted John's wrist, hesitated longest, his slit-pupilled eyes reflecting an intelligence that mirrored the mother's. Then, with a final flick of her tail that sent snow crystals swirling in hypnotic patterns, she stepped into the trees. The forest swallowed them whole. One heartbeat they were there, solid, real, more alive than anything John had ever known. The next, only undisturbed snow remained where they'd stood. No tracks, no disturbed branches, as if the wilderness itself had conspired to erase their passage. John didn't move. The cold seeped through his boots, numbing his toes. The wind whispered through the spruce boughs, carrying the faintest echo of harmonic tones, a fading vibration that might have been imagination. He counted his breaths, each exhale a ghostly plume in the still air, waiting for something, a sign, a farewell, a reason to follow. None came. Slowly, mechanically, John turned toward the remains of his cabin. The structure listed drunkenly, its roof collapsed inward from the fire, blackened timbers jutting like broken ribs. Smoke still curled from the ruins, the acrid scent of burned insulation and melted plastic clashing with the pristine Arctic morning. His footsteps crunched loudly in the snow, each sound jarring in the silence they'd left behind. The door hung by one hinge, its surface pockmarked with bullet holes. John pushed it aside with a gloved hand, the metal screeching in protest. The interior was a war zone. Overturned furniture, shattered glass, dark stains on the floorboards that could have been blood or chemical residue. And everywhere, the lingering ozone scent of the mother creature's presence, already fading. John's knees gave out. He sank onto the scorched remains of his hearth, the Winchester clattering to the floor beside him. His hands trembled, not from cold, but from the enormity of what had happened. In 72 hours, his entire world had upended. The carefully constructed solitude he'd cherished lay in ruins, and he was different. John flexed his fingers, studying them in the watery light. The frostbite that should have claimed his fingertips was gone. The scars from a lifetime of wilderness living had smoothed over. When he pressed a hand to his chest, his heartbeat felt slower, stronger, other. A glint caught his eye beneath the overturned kitchen table. John crawled forward, brushing aside debris until his fingers closed around the object, the mother creature's collar tag. The metal was warm to the touch, the engraved words still visible beneath the grime. Project Cerberus Specimen 07 Alpha. The 7 had been scratched out, replaced by a single claw mark. A reclamation. John's vision blurred. He clutched the tag tightly, the edges biting into his palm. Outside, the wind rose again, carrying with it the faintest whisper of something that might have been a howl, or just his fractured mind seeking comfort. He didn't know how long he sat there. The sun climbed higher, its weak light doing little to warm the ruins. Eventually, the practical part of his brain, the part that had kept him alive all these years, kicked in. John moved mechanically. He salvaged what little remained usable. A dented pot. His grandfather's hunting knife, miraculously unscathed. The waterlogged pages of his journal, the ink bleeding but still legible. Each item went into his emergency pack with military precision. Last, he pried up a loose floorboard near the stove, his true emergency cache. The sealed metal box inside contained cash, fake IDs, and a .45 pistol with extra magazines. Contingencies from his Special Forces days he'd never expected to need. The tag went around his neck on its original leather, hidden beneath his thermal layers. The metal burned against his sternum, a constant reminder. By midday, John stood at the edge of his property, pack heavy on his shoulders. Behind him, the cabin sagged in on itself, its wounds too deep to heal. Ahead lay the tree line where she'd vanished, and beyond that, the vast Alaskan wilderness. Somewhere out there, a white-pawed cub was learning to hunt. A scarred mother was reclaiming her birthright, and men in black uniforms were still searching. John adjusted the pack's straps and stepped into the trees. The forest welcomed him like a lost child coming home. The thaw came early that year. John watched from his new cabin's porch as winter's grip loosened, the snow receding like a reluctant tide. Each morning revealed more of the forest floor, last autumn's fallen needles emerging from their white shroud, frozen creeks groaning as they broke free. The wilderness was waking, and with it, something in John's blood stirred in response. He rubbed at the tag beneath his shirt, its surface worn smooth by weeks of absent touches. The nightmares hadn't stopped, visions of golden eyes and snow that moved against the wind. But the raw edges had dulled. By daylight, he almost convinced himself it had all been some fever dream. Almost. The changes wouldn't let him forget. His reflection in the creek water showed a man aging backward, deep lines softening, gray hairs darkening at the roots. The bullet wound on his shoulder from a long-ago tour in Afghanistan had vanished completely, leaving only unmarked skin. Worst were the dreams where he ran on all fours beneath a full moon, his bones singing as they reshaped themselves. John splashed icy water on his face. "Get a grip, Carter," he muttered to the empty woods. The new cabin stood 5 miles from the ruins of his old one, built in a sheltered gully where the wind couldn't find it. Smaller, colder, a place to hide, not live. He'd chosen the location using skills he hadn't practiced since the army. False trails, scent masking, thermal shadowing. Every precaution to ensure they wouldn't find him. They. The word tasted bitter. He'd seen no sign of the black-clad commandos since that dawn in the snow, but the Fairbanks PD had asked too many questions about wild dogs in the area. The university research facility break-in made local news for exactly 1 cycle before disappearing like it had never happened. John was stirring a pot of venison stew when the sound came. Not a knock, not a scratch. A pattern. 3 quick taps against the doorframe, followed by 2 slow ones. The same sequence the mother creature had used on the ice. The wooden spoon snapped in John's grip. He moved without thought, Winchester in hand, safety off. But his finger hovered above the trigger. The cabin's single oil lamp guttered as a draft slipped beneath the door, making shadows dance like living things. John's pulse hammered in his throat as he reached for the latch. The metal was freezing under his fingertips despite the warm spring night. He opened the door. Moonlight flooded in, painting the porch in silver. And there she stood, larger than he remembered, her silvered fur gleaming with an almost metallic sheen. Those golden eyes held the same ancient knowing, but something new flickered in their depths. Something like amusement? "You," John breathed. The mother creature huffed through her nostrils, definitely laughing at him, and stepped aside to reveal 3 shadows waiting at the tree line. The cubs had grown, not just in size, but in presence. They stood taller, their movements more deliberate, their coats shimmering with that same unnatural light as their mother's. The bold male's black markings had spread into intricate whorls across his shoulders, like tribal tattoos. The white-pawed female watched John with eerie focus, her pupils dilating as she took him in. But it was the third cub, the one he'd carried through the storm, that stepped forward first. Her gait was different now, more fluid, her paws leaving faintly glowing impressions in the damp earth. She stopped just beyond the porch's edge and tilted her head in that achingly familiar way, waiting. John's knees threatened to buckle. He braced himself against the door frame, the Winchester forgotten at his side. The mother creature made a soft, chuffing noise and nudged past him into the cabin, her massive body moving with impossible grace between the cramped furniture. She went straight to the stew pot and sniffed appreciatively. John barked a laugh that bordered on hysterical. "Seriously?" The mother gave him a look that could only be described as unimpressed, before dipping her muzzle delicately into the pot. The cubs took this as permission and bounded inside, their movements a blur of shimmering fur and 2 intelligent eyes. Within seconds, they'd investigated every corner of the cabin, the bold male even pawing through John's pack with dexterous claws. John watched, dumbfounded, as his carefully constructed solitude was invaded by creatures that shouldn't exist. The white-pawed female jumped onto his bed and began turning in circles, her claws kneading the blankets into a nest. The third cub, his cub, sat patiently by the cold hearth, watching him expectantly. The mother finished her stew inspection and locked eyes with John. Then, with deliberate slowness, she lowered herself onto her haunches in the center of the room, the same posture she'd taken that first night in the storm. A choice. A question. John's fingers found the tag at his neck, the metal warm against his skin. Outside, the forest whispered secrets older than mankind. Inside, 4 pairs of golden eyes watched him, waiting. He knew then that no amount of running would change what he'd become, what they'd made him. John exhaled a breath he'd been holding for weeks, and reached for the extra bowls. "Guess I'm making more stew." The mother creature's tail thumped once against the floor, and just like that, the wilderness reclaimed its own. The spring night hummed with unseen energy as John stood frozen in the cabin's doorway, his calloused hand suspended in the charged air between them. Moonlight dripped through the pine boughs, painting the mother creature's silvered fur in liquid mercury. She had changed since their parting. Larger somehow, her spine ridges more pronounced, her golden eyes holding depths of knowledge that made John's breath catch. Behind her, the 3 cubs had grown into formidable creatures, their forms caught between wolf and something far older. The bold male's black markings now swirled across his shoulders like living tattoos, pulsing faintly with each breath. The white-pawed female stood poised at his flank, her once-injured leg now strong, her gaze sharper than any blade. And the smallest, the one John had cradled against his heart through the storm, watched him with eyes that held galaxies of understanding. The mother creature took the final step forward, her massive head pressed into John's trembling palm, her breath warm against his wrist. The contact sent a jolt through him, not the painful surge of their first connection, but something deeper. A current of shared memory flowed between them, her standing over him in the blizzard, her body shielding his from the killing wind. Him pressing the smallest cub to his bare chest, willing his own warmth into her tiny frame. The moment on the frozen river when he'd chosen to follow rather than flee. The images faded, leaving behind a profound silence. John's fingers curled instinctively into her thick fur, feeling the impossible warmth beneath, the thrum of a heartbeat that shouldn't exist. Her scent enveloped him, pine resin and ozone and something indefinably wild. The cubs moved as one. The bold male approached first, his nose brushing John's knee in a gesture that mirrored their first meeting, yet carried new weight. When John reached to touch him, the creature's fur shifted color beneath his fingers, darkening to match John's own weathered skin tone in real time. "Jesus," John breathed. The white-pawed female came next, pressing her forehead to John's shin with deliberate care. Heat radiated from her touch, sinking through his jeans to soothe old hunting injuries he'd forgotten about. The scars on his knee from a fall 2 winters back simply dissolved. But it was the smallest cub, now nearly as tall as his waist, who shattered John completely. She approached with none of her siblings' caution, rising onto her hind legs to place both forepaws against John's chest. The position mirrored how he'd carried her through the storm, her claws retracted to avoid damaging his shirt. Her golden eyes searched his face, seeing everything, the loneliness, the fear of what he was becoming, the unspoken question of why they'd returned. Then she licked his chin. A laugh burst from John's chest, unexpected and bright in the quiet forest. The sound seemed to startle the cubs, their ears swiveling forward in unison. The mother creature made a soft chuffing noise that might have been laughter herself. The moment hung suspended between them, fragile as a snowflake. Then the bold male sneezed violently, breaking the spell. He immediately began investigating John's boots with intense focus, his nose leaving glowing smudges on the leather. John stepped back to let them inside, his movements slow and deliberate. The cabin, once a hollow shell of survival, seemed to breathe anew as they entered. The mother creature went straight to the hearth, her massive frame settling onto the rug with regal ease. The cubs fanned out, exploring with quiet curiosity. The white-pawed female paused at John's small bookshelf, nudging a volume of Robert Service poetry with her nose. The bold male discovered John's sock drawer and immediately began redistributing its contents around the cabin. And the smallest cub, his cub, jumped onto the bed and curled into the exact spot where John usually slept. John leaned against the door frame, watching this invasion of his solitude with an odd tightness in his chest. The mother creature met his gaze, her eyes reflecting the lamplight in prismatic shards. No words passed between them. None were needed. The wilderness had come home. And John Carter, loner, survivor, lost soul, found he didn't mind at all. The first light of dawn gilded the forest floor as John stood at the edge of the clearing, watching their silhouettes fade into the trees. The mother creature paused one last time, her massive frame haloed in mist rising from the thawing earth. Behind her, the 3 grown cubs stood like sentinels, their golden eyes catching the sun's early rays and fracturing them into prismatic shards across the ferns. John's smile wasn't the hesitant twitch of lips from his solitary days, but a full, unguarded expression that warmed his face like sunlight. His fingers absently traced the outline of the collar tag beneath his shirt. No longer just a relic, but a talisman, pulsing gently against his sternum in time with his slowing heartbeat. Some bonds are stronger than fear. The thought settled into his bones with the weight of absolute truth. He remembered the terror of that first night, the unnatural intelligence in those golden eyes, the way his survival instincts had screamed at him to shut the door. Now the memory drew a quiet chuckle from his chest. The mother creature tilted her head at the sound, her ears swiveling forward. For a heartbeat, John swore she smiled back. Stronger than science. The tag grew warm beneath his fingers as if agreeing. He'd spent weeks researching what little he could find about Project Cerberus, blacked out government reports, conspiracy forums mentioning canine hybridization trials, a single declassified photo of a lab door bearing that ominous three-headed symbol. None of it could explain what he'd witnessed. The way ice reformed at her command, how the cub's fur shifted colors like living camouflage. The impossible visions she'd shared through touch. Science had no framework for this. A breeze stirred the pines, carrying the scent of melting snow and something richer. Wild sage and lightning-struck stone. The mother creature lifted her muzzle, sampling the air with deliberate care. Her posture shifted subtly, the ridges along her spine flaring open to reveal bioluminescent veins that pulsed once, twice. A signal. The cubs moved as one, their forms blurring at the edges as they stepped into the tree line. Not fleeing, not retreating, simply transitioning between worlds. The bold male went first, his black markings shimmering into the shadows. The white-pawed female followed, pausing to glance back at John with what could only be described as a promise. Then the smallest cub, his cub, did something extraordinary. She bounded back to John in 3 effortless leaps and pressed her forehead against his knee, just as she'd done as a dying pup in the storm. Heat radiated from the contact, sinking through his jeans to erase an old ache he hadn't even noticed. When she pulled away, her eyes held the same knowing glint as her mother's. "We remember." The words formed in John's mind without sound, crisp and clear as mountain air. His breath caught. This was new. Before, communication had been images, emotions, never words. The cub turned and vanished into the undergrowth, her silvered tail flicking once in farewell. The mother creature held John's gaze a moment longer, her golden eyes reflecting not just his face, but countless dawns that had come before, and countless more yet to unfold. Then she too was gone. Not vanished, not disappeared, but stepped sideways into some deeper layer of the forest that John's ordinary senses couldn't perceive. The space where she'd stood shimmered briefly, the air vibrating at a frequency that made his teeth hum. Silence settled over the clearing. John exhaled slowly, watching his breath mist in the cool morning air. His cabin stood behind him, its windows glowing with lamplight, the door still ajar from their departure. It looked different now, not a hiding place, but a way station. A place between worlds. He touched the tag again, its warmth lingering like a handshake held too long. They would return. Not tomorrow, perhaps not even this season. But when the time was right, when the stars aligned in whatever celestial pattern governed their movements, he would hear that familiar knock, and he would open the door. The forest whispered around him, alive with secrets. Somewhere beyond the visible spectrum, paws moved soundlessly over moss. A tail brushed a fern into momentary stillness. Golden eyes watched from the spaces between shadows. John turned back toward the cabin, his boots leaving faintly glowing prints in the dew-kissed grass that faded by the time he reached the porch. The legend grew in hushed tones around backcountry campfires, passed between trappers and guides, with the reverence reserved for sacred things. They spoke of it first in the Brooks Range, then down through the Alaska Range, until even the tourists in Anchorage's roughest bars knew to lower their voices when the stories began. You don't hunt near Carter's old territory, not unless you want them watching you. Old Man Jenkins claimed he saw them first during the '98 season. His hands shook when he told the story at the Fairbanks Lodge, his coffee gone cold as he described the storm that nearly claimed him. How the whiteout had swallowed his snow machine whole, how the cold sank its teeth deep before he'd even realized he was lost. "Thought I was done for," he'd rasp, tapping his pipe against the hearth. "Then I saw the lights, gold eyes floating in the dark, not reflecting my headlamp, mind you, glowing from within." The other hunters would lean in then, despite themselves. "They herded me," Jenkins would continue. "Not like dogs chasing sheep. More like guides. Every time I veered off course, one would appear, just a shadow at the edge of vision, steering me toward this old cabin half buried in drifts. He always paused here to roll up his sleeve, showing the scar that hadn't been there before that night. 3 parallel marks, too precise to be claws, too symmetrical to be accidental. They shimmered faintly under certain light, like mica flecks in granite. Found the door unlocked, stove still warm, and on the table, his voice would drop to a whisper. A bowl of stew so fresh it was still steaming. No one ever pointed out that Carter's cabin had burned to the ground years earlier. The stories multiplied with each passing season. A bush pilot swore 4 luminous shapes paced his plane when he went down near Denali, keeping the wolves at bay until rescue came. Fishermen told of a silver shadow that moved beneath the ice when their friend fell through, pushing him toward the hole with impossible precision. Even the park rangers had a file, unofficial of course, documenting dozens of miraculous rescues where lost hikers reported being led to safety by unusually large wolves that didn't act like wolves. But it was the night the Cerberus team returned that cemented the legend. 3 black SUVs rolled into Talkeetna one October, their windows tinted darker than any legal limit. Men in unmarked cold-weather gear asked questions at the diner, showed grainy photos of dangerous hybrid animals. To trappers, left envelopes of cash on bar counters with instructions to call if anything unusual was spotted. That same night, every security camera within 50 miles malfunctioned between 2:17 and 2:23 a.m. The next morning, the SUVs were found abandoned at a trailhead, engines still running. The doors were locked from the inside. The men were gone. Only 2 things of note were discovered. 1. The vehicle's interiors were spotless. No struggle, no blood, not even fingerprints on the steering wheels. 2. Fresh paw prints circled each SUV exactly 3 times before vanishing into thin air. Not wolf, not dog, something in between. The prints glowed faintly for 3 days before fading. John heard the stories during his supply runs to small towns, moving between them like a ghost himself. His hair had stopped graying years ago, his face settling into an ageless ruggedness that made bartenders card him twice before serving. He'd nod along to the tales, fingers absently tracing the tag beneath his shirt, and leave without comment. But sometimes, when the northern lights danced particularly bright, he'd wake to find fresh tracks around his latest cabin. Not approaching, just circling, watching. One autumn evening, as he split wood for the coming winter, a familiar chill ran down his spine. The forest had gone preternaturally still. No chickadees chattering, no squirrels rustling in the underbrush. John set down his axe and turned slowly. At the tree line, 4 pairs of golden eyes watched from the gathering dusk, not hiding, not threatening, simply checking in. The mother creature stepped forward first, her silvered fur now threaded with luminous white. Not age, but something more profound. The cubs followed, their forms having grown into their power. The bold male's markings had evolved into intricate geometric patterns that shifted as he moved. The white-pawed female carried herself with quiet authority, her once injured leg now stronger than the others. And the smallest, now nearly as large as her mother, bounded ahead with unmistakable joy. John didn't speak, didn't need to. He simply opened his arms, and for the first time in all their years, they came not as visitors, but as family returning home. The northern lights blazed overhead that night, their colors more vivid than any living soul could remember. Old-timers in distant towns would later swear they saw shapes moving within the aurora. 4 luminous figures running joyously through the stars, trailed by the shadow of a man who had learned to fly. The Arctic night breathes differently when the temperature plunges below -60 degrees Fahrenheit. The snow itself seems to crystallize into something sharper, the air turning to liquid glass in your lungs. It's during these deadly cold snaps, when even the ravens hunker down in sheltered hollows, that the old-timers tell you to listen. Not for danger, for the song. It starts as barely more than a vibration, felt through boot soles before it's heard. Snow crystals dance on bare rock surfaces without wind. Ice formations chime like distant bells. Then, if you're very still and very lucky, the true sound emerges, a harmony woven from frequencies no earthly throat should produce. The scientists who've tried to record it describe the phenomenon as atmospheric resonance. The Gwich'in elders call it Dal Gen, the ghost wind, but the trappers and bush pilots who owe their lives to it know better. They call it John's Choir. The sound follows no predictable pattern. Sometimes years pass between performances. Other winters, it sings weekly. Always during the worst weather. Always near someone in desperate need. Like when young Ellie Rasmussen's snowmobile died near Galbraith Lake during the 2009 polar vortex. She swore the engine's dying sputters were answered by 4 clear notes from the surrounding ridges. High, pure tones that cut through the storm's roar. The howls guided her to an ice cave she never would have found alone, where embers still glowed in a long-dead fire. Or the doomed Cerberus expedition of 2015, their last transmission captured on a recovered satellite phone. The lights! They're hurting us! Oh God, their eyes! Before cutting to 30 seconds of that unearthly choir, search teams found their camp perfectly intact. Meals half-eaten. Coffee still warm. No bodies, no blood. Just a single set of human footprints leading away northward, accompanied by 4 sets of massive paw prints that disappeared after 50 yards. If you press the right people after enough whiskey, they'll share the real stories. The ones that never make reports. Like how the choir's harmony changed after the 2018 wildfire season, gaining a 5th, distinctly human vocal timbre. Or how the northernmost research stations have logged impossible thermal readings, human-shaped heat signatures moving at wolf speed across territory no man could survive. The most telling detail comes from the night watchmen along the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. They swear that during the deepest cold snaps, security cameras briefly flicker to static. When the image returns, there's often a man-shaped blur moving alongside 4 luminous canid forms, their progress marked by frost patterns blooming in perfect fractal spirals across the steel. John Carter's official death certificate was filed 7 years after his disappearance. The paperwork lists him as presumed deceased, lost to the Alaskan wilderness he loved. His few remaining relatives held a small memorial service outside, burying an empty casket next to his father's grave. They never knew about the will he'd left with a Fairbanks lawyer. A single page instructing that his ashes, if ever found, be scattered at coordinates matching a remote stretch of the Brooks Range. Nor did they see the footnote added in different ink years later. Burn the cabin too. She'll know what it means. On certain nights, when the aurora bleeds particularly green, and the cold could kill a caribou in minutes, something remarkable happens near those coordinates. The wind stills. The snow stops mid-fall. And from a cabin that hasn't existed for decades comes the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open. 4 pairs of golden eyes gleam in the non-existent doorway. A 5th shadow stands among them, its outline blurring at the edges where human form meets something older. Then the choir begins. Not a howl of hunger, not a cry of fear, but a psalm of gratitude that shakes the stars loose from the sky. And if you listen very closely as the last note fades, you might hear something else beneath the harmony. The soft, contented sigh of a man who finally came home.